Welcome again and hello, I'm Deanna Cohen, CEO and co-founder of Plastic Pollution Coalition. Thank you for joining our October webinar, Policy Matters, the UN Global Plastics Treaty. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, regenerative world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. We have 4 poll questions today to get a sense of who is joining us. Each question will only appear for about 20 seconds, so please answer quickly. Poll question 1, where are you joining us from today? I see that the majority of folks are tuning in from North America and Canada, but it looks like we also have people tuned in from Europe, North Asia, Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands, Asia, and Africa. Let's move on to poll question 2. What best describes the sector in which you work? I see it looks like the majority of folks tuning into the webinar are based in the nonprofit and NGO sector, but we also have people tuning in from corporations and business, from education, both from academia, administration, faculty, and educators, as well as education and more of those from academia as in students. There are also people tuning in from the government and policy sector, healthcare, media, research, and then other. I'm very curious what the 14% of other, what those folks are coming from. Let's move on to poll question 3. Are you or your organization workplace involved in the UN Global Plastics Treaty? If yes, to what extent? It looks like about 38% of you are not involved, but are somewhat familiar with the topic. 32% are not involved and don't know much about it, so I hope you're tuning in to learn. And then 13% on the webinar are extremely involved, and 18% are somewhat involved. Let's move on to poll question number 4. What issue area of the treaty are you most interested in learning more about? This is multiple choice. It looks like a really wide range. People are interested in the environmental justice part of the treaty, health, climate, production, extraction, recycling, incineration or waste to energy, and waste management. I'd like to thank you for participating in the poll questions. Before we introduce our panelists today, we would like to share a short video with you about a powerful new tool we just launched with key partners, Break Free from Plastic Europe, the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, and the Surfrider Foundation. The Global Plastic Laws database, our Global Plastic Laws is a database and resource library focused on plastic legislation that has been passed around the world. And we'd like to share this with you. So here is a brief overview. Please check out the Global Plastic Laws database. We hope that many of you will find it useful in your work. This tool is particularly relevant in the UN Plastics Treaty negotiations, which we will be discussing today. Today, we are going to be hearing from Joe Banner, Christopher Chin, Justine Maillot, and Larke Williams in conversation with Rachel Radvany. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Rachel Radvany. Rachel is the Program Associate for Plastics Policy on the Environmental Health Team at the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. She contributes to the team's work in advancing the negotiation of an ambitious and effective global plastics treaty, including supporting the facilitation of the Global Civil Society and Rights Holders Coalition that is weighing in on the negotiations. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you to the PPC team for hosting this webinar and also for the amazing new plastic laws database, which is going to be incredibly useful in the context of the Plastics Treaty. We at CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, I know are very excited about this new tool. So before we dive in and before I introduce our amazing panelists today, I wanted to provide a quick bit of background before the discussion. So in March of 2022, the United Nations Environment Assembly adopted a resolution which set up an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, to elaborate an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, commonly referred to as the Global Plastics Treaty. We've had 2 meetings of the INC so far, one in December of 2022 in Punta del Este in Uruguay, and one in June of 2023 in Paris, France. The 3rd meeting of the INC is coming up in a little less than 3 weeks, from November 11th to 19th in Nairobi, Kenya. And the main focus of INC 3 will be the recently released Zero Draft of the Plastics Treaty, which the chair of the INC developed based on the discussions at the first 2 meetings. It includes a range of options for the treaty's elements, which countries will begin to refine during INC 3 and will continue doing so throughout the rest of the process through the end of 2024, and there will be 2 more INCs in 2024. Today's panel will focus on these upcoming negotiations and what is essential to include in the Global Plastics Treaty in order to end plastic pollution and its impacts on human health, the environment, and human rights. So first, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Larke Williams. Larke is the lead plastic pollution negotiator in the U.S. Department of State, serving as the senior advisor on plastic pollution and waste management. She's been with the department since 2016, working on chemicals, air quality, and waste issues, and previously served at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, working on climate change, air quality, hydraulic fracturing, and environmental justice. Welcome, Larke.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here today, and really, I'm just excited to talk about plastic pollution with everyone. This is such an important issue. It's a tremendously important issue for this administration. And that was really demonstrated actually before the launch of this process. We actually had the Secretary of State announce that the U.S. would be supporting the mandate to launch negotiations on a global agreement on plastic pollution. So I'm really pleased to be here today and to carry some of these messages forward. So as she noted, we're in a really pivotal stage right now. We are at this place where we are going to be calling for, we're in the middle of the process, and we're going to be moving from high conceptual discussion to, as Rachel noted, moving to discussions on actual what the text of the instrument can look like. And we're, I really want to recognize this process because, for an international process to sort of make the jump from concept to text means that there's a lot of faith in the process, there's the faith in the chair, and that countries really want to take action. And what you're seeing is a tremendous level of public engagement and support. I think it's a testament that I'm being invited here today. The esteemed speakers that I share this panel with, these are really wonderfully smart and intelligent people, and we're all putting our brain power towards combating plastic pollution. And so, I'm just very pleased to be here today. So what's going to happen? So INC 3, as we call it, or the 3rd session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, is the first time we're going to dig into the text. We have this draft text, and it's really a starting point for the negotiations. the chair put this together based on what he heard and what he understood with the help of the Secretariat. But it's really up to the countries that are the members of this Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or what I'm going to start calling the INC. And it's up to us to sort of bring forward our ideas on what the instrument should look like, and, modifications and discussions. And so we're expecting that this discussions and what's going to happen at INC3 is we're going to break out into 3 things that we call contact groups. And so these discussions in this contact groups are going to be more targeted, and they're going to really be thinking about, what are the improvements we need on the text so that we can kind of find this place of convergence among countries and figure out how we're going to develop this instrument. So, one of our goals is to ensure that we think that the range of options that countries are bringing forward is well captured, and that we set ourselves up to really understand how countries are thinking about this issue and thinking about how they're developing an instrument. Just for general awareness, there is going to be a 1-day preparatory meeting, and this is to help us play a little catch up. It's an opportunity for us to discuss some of the elements that haven't been, discussed as in depth. And then we're going to take all this information, and then we're going to go into the 3rd session, which is going to be scheduled for 7 days out in Nairobi. So I think that's sort of some of the process, and I definitely welcome answering more questions about the process or providing more information. What I can say now is that I want to talk about a little bit about what the U.S. position is going into this instrument. I think it's helpful to understand, what the U.S. is promoting as we think about developing a global agreement on plastic pollution. So we are seeking to develop an ambitious and inclusive legally binding instrument. So that's an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And as we develop our positioning, so that's sort of what we're going to be talking about, what our views are. We've really been listening to the views of many of our stakeholders of other countries, and what we've heard brought forward at the previous sessions of the INC. And so what we're doing is we're looking to develop meaningful and feasible obligations. So that's the legally binding thing that we're obligated to do as parties. And we want to, aim those towards reducing plastic pollution throughout the life cycle of plastic. And that's from upstream to downstream. So, there's a wide variety of ways you could approach those obligations, and we're still thinking through that. But what we are doing is we know that in developing these obligations, we want to be protecting human health and the environment. And we think we need to do this in a way that prevents and reduces plastic pollution. So we're looking at obligations in a few different areas. And I'll just run through these for your awareness. So some of them are releasing plastic into the environment, thinking about the demand for plastic, the risks that could be posed by certain chemicals and polymers that contribute to plastic pollution. We're thinking about a just transition in vulnerable communities. We're also thinking about framing on frequently littered plastic products, product design and measures for reuse and repair and refurbishment and recycling. We're looking at obligations in the area of safer and more environmentally sustainable alternatives and substitutes to plastic, and waste management. So we know that, when we get these obligations and as we develop them with countries, a critical part to our overall success in combating plastic pollution will be how these are implemented. And so for us, national action plans will be a very important part of this. It's going to primarily facilitate implementation and reporting on these obligations. And, we know that it's not a free-for-all. As we develop these plans, it's important that, we have a sound understanding of how we're all approaching these together. We also recognize that for this instrument, it's not, its success is going to be determined by a number of things, but it's not only what it says, it's also who it includes. And from our perspective, we want an instrument that will have universal membership. We want every country that is a major producer, a major consumer of plastic, we want them to be a part of this instrument. From our perspective, we're a major producer of plastic. And, we recognize that we are a part of the problem, and we must absolutely be a part of the solution. We also know we can't leave anyone behind. We really need all countries to work together throughout the negotiations to find a path forward. And we're going to need some creative collaboration. And, this is one of the things I think it's so important for these types of engagements. We really do value our input and engagement with stakeholders. It's part of the reason I'm here today. Is it's important that we get this message out in a variety of ways. We also know we're going to need systemic change. Countries are going to need to think about how they can take actions throughout the life cycle of plastic. And, we also recognize, and this is something I think I've heard echoed by many of my fellow panelists, waste management and recycling alone, this is not enough to solve this global problem. So, that's sort of our framing and how we're approaching the negotiations, and sort of what we are developing is called our US position. So that's some high level overview of that. I want to give you some context for the zero draft text. So the text itself is really it has this wide range of views, and from our perspectives, it is this very good starting point for the negotiations. And I think it's really going to be important for us to sort of use that and to hit the ground running and to really start to make progress as quickly as we can on the instrument. So with that, I want to wrap up. I'm happy to take a number of questions at the end, but really appreciate being here today. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, and I just thank you again so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Larke, for the contextualization of where we're at in the negotiations and the overview of the U.S. position and priorities. I think we're all very excited to dive into the substance at INC3. Next, I'd like to introduce Jo Banner. Jo is the co-founder of the Descendants project, where she channels her affection and knowledge into challenging systems, primarily legal systems, that have exploited the descendants, such as herself, of those enslaved to plantations. She has spoken before the United Nations, and she participated in the first and second intergovernmental negotiating committees to develop the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Jo works with several industries, including entertainment, tourism, and green jobs, to provide job options outside the petrochemical industry. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today and hearing about my experience working with the Plastics Treaty. Very excited to be a part of this. This opportunity was introduced to me through Break Free from Plastic. So I just want to make sure and give a shout out to them for introducing me to the process and helping me along and understanding the treaty work. I did participate in a CERT committee meeting at the United Nations before, but this was a whole different side of the treaty talk. So it's an education as I'm going through the process. There's a lot to learn, especially coming from a fence line community, a small town like Wallace, Louisiana. Never imagined that I would be working on something this big and important, but very much happy to participate in this opportunity. So my presentation is called Breaking the Chains, Plantations to Petrochemicals to Plastics. And that's what my role is, I feel, at least for myself, when I go into the treaty space, is drawing the link to the systemic exploitation, honestly, of people like me, descendants of the enslaved, who continue to face issues that were created by slavery and ignoring of one demographic's health in order to go into heavy industry and refine and make a product. In the 1700s, 1800s, that was sugar. Now we see it in many different forms happening. And one of that is being through the production of plastic. So I want to tell you, when I am going to the treaty negotiations, I always highlight, and I have the opportunity to intervene where I'm from. And I'm from St. John the Baptist Parish, which is in the middle of a place called Cancer Alley. But before it was Cancer Alley, let me just give a little bit more context to that. It is my home. It's the place that I love. My family has been a part of St. John the Baptist Parish for 300 years. The street that I live on, my family has been on that street for over 100 years. The land was purchased by my great-grandfather, so we live as essentially a little village in St. John the Baptist Parish. My story is not necessarily unique. There are many communities like mine that are made of Black descendants. They're called Freetown. So we have these Black little pockets all along Cancer Alley, and there's a lot of history and rootedness. And that land is so important because of how these people who were enslaved to plantations had nothing on their backs, pulled their money together, bought land in an effort to keep their families together. And that's why I'm still there. But let me go back to what is Cancer Alley. It's a 170-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And St. John Parish is right in the middle of that. It's a location of 300 heavy industry plants, with approximately 250 connected to the production of petrochemicals or plastics in some way. residents in my area, we experience the highest rate of cancer in the country, this 95th percentile of cancer rate. My community, my town, Wallace, actually has a 97% percentile of cancer risk. So it's even higher than St. John the Baptist Parish as a whole. And its connection, as I mentioned before, is directly related to the area's population of plantations. Cancer Alley, St. John the Baptist Parish, St. James Parish, and St. Charles Parish was the highest density of plantations, sugar plantations you had in the country, and particularly in Louisiana. And now we're seeing that land go directly to the petrochemical companies. So to prove this point, I have a graphic that was designed and published in the Atlantic newspaper. You'll see that every yellow dot represents a plantation. That blue line down the middle is the Mississippi River. Every red dot now is a petrochemical plant. So you will see just how much these two are linked together. It's a graphic that I always show. I think it just so clearly shows what we say when we mean a petrochemical and plantation link. And so why do we have this link? We have this because the plantations most of them were located on large acreage of available land post-emancipation. So as you had these plantation owning families after the war, they did not really know what to do with their plantations. Many of them in one sense went bankrupt. So you have this land now, and it's one family that owns it. So it's easier, right, to have somebody to just come and purchase the large acreage of land without having to go through multiple owners. So it made it easier for petrochemical companies to be able to come in and buy that land that they needed in order to put their industry there. Also have to think of, as I mentioned before, the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is a road. It's the reason why New Orleans is the oldest city that we have in Louisiana, as a port city, of course. And all these plantations had to have access to the river in order for them to be able to ship in goods and also to export sugar. So they had that prime location on the river. Then the last, you had an accommodating political system. So we have a governmental system that participated and that allowed people to be kidnapped, looked the other way, brought over to this country, and then used for heavy refining, of sugar. And that was okay. And so we said they knew the health impacts, they could see what was happening, and there was no one to really keep them in check. So now we still see these same issues happening, and that's why we have what we have in Louisiana with the petrochemical and other dangerous heavy industry. So here is another example. This graphic comes directly from the EPA. It shows the information, the information comes from the EPA. The graphic was developed by Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. You will see that red splotch in the middle of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and that's Cancer Alley, showing you that cancer risk. And it's an image that it's sad. I mean, really, when I think about my home in the middle of that, and seeing that red and that deep red, really just it's danger, right? You just see the danger of it. And that's what we're dealing with. So when we're part of these treaty talks, and I know we're talking about Louisiana and Louisiana's government, and it seems like such an isolated problem, but what's happening here is an international crisis. Everyone has so many different entities around the globe that are connected to the plastic production that's happening in Louisiana. It's not just concentrated, although the pollution may be concentrated here, it's everyone kind of colluding and participating in this process, much like slavery. It happened in Louisiana, other places too had a high concentration, but it took the globe to cooperate in order to make the system of slavery work. And we're seeing a lot of this, happen in addition to the plastic production through different means. But here is a graphic that I want to show. This comes directly from the Port of South Louisiana. You can see in 2022, the Port of South Louisiana had over 41 million short tons of petrochemicals were moved through that one port in Louisiana in 2022. That's a 22% increase from 2021. So all of this, the petrochemicals, it's going all over the world. That port in South Louisiana in the middle of Cancer Alley is the largest tonnage port in the Western Hemisphere. And they always like to brag about that. So it shows you the volume of chemicals that is coming in through this one port. Petrochemicals is just one. There's chemical fertilizers, there's coke and coal and steel and crude oil, and even grain causes a lot of pollution. If you know our story, fighting the grain terminal, is another form that we have to do. So we have to think of. But this also shows to the cumulative pollution that we have in the area, in addition to the petrochemical companies and what they're producing. Just recently, also to tell you why, to show you what, how serious it is in St. John Parish, we were recently identified as the most climate vulnerable county we have in the country. That's out of 70,000 different counties that were measured. This climate vulnerability index that was developed by Environmental Defense Fund, in addition with Texas A&M University, used 180 metrics. This index used more metrics than anybody else's current type of measurement, such as the EPA. I think they only used about 20. This one used 180 and found that after all those metrics were put together, St. John came as the most climate vulnerable county in the country. And again, we want to make sure that this message is something that we bring to the treaty talks, because climate is always, it's a big issue. We know that the greenhouse gases that are being emitted, the other pollution is a direct impact to what's happening. Also, the land loss that happens when these plants come in is another factor. We're losing the buffer zones for hurricanes. We're using that land, so now we're getting hurricanes of much more strength along the river parishes, along more areas in Louisiana, but we're feeling the impact of that land loss. Just this came up actually for a few days ago. You may have heard about this wreck in St. John Parish where 8 people were killed and 150 vehicles were involved, and I think about 30 people were injured. Major crash. This happened because of a super fog. There was also a marsh fire happening at the same time. And imagine that this air is also foggy and smoggy before you even have all of this. So putting this together, you get what happened just recently with this wreck. Again, shows you the climate vulnerability of what we have in St. John Parish. Also, what I discuss in my treaty interventions or any information that I put out there is also how plastics is connected to the loss of our sacred spaces. This is a refinery, Shell refinery in Ascension Parish, which is maybe 20 miles upriver from me. On the Shell property, there was a burial site for the enslaved where 1,000 people were found. Everywhere you find a plantation, and remember, these petrochemical companies are in the footprint of plantations. No secret to that. Everywhere there's a plantation, there's a burial ground for the enslaved, at least one. And that's not even counting like the burial grounds for the indigenous people too, because of course it was their land first. So you have these burial sites that we know are there. And this was another instance of a burial site being found. You can see where the tree line is that the burial site that was identified, and the background you see the Shell refinery behind it. In this space, let me just say, this is not accessible to the public. So the descendants, they can't go into this and honor their ancestors. There was a memorial service done years ago, but if I wanted to go and visit or pay respect to my ancestors, like other people can go to cemeteries, you can't do that. And then also look at what the background is. So really showing and expressing during these treaty talks how our heritage is being impacted by this pollution and the production of plastic. Here's another example. These are cemeteries in St. John, St. James, and St. Charles parishes. And you can see as all of these are right next to fence line to these plants. So we just think it's absolutely abhorrent that anyone would have to pay respects to their loved ones and have this as the background. And actually, these are lucky ones, I guess, in a sense, because at least the graves have not been upturned. A lot of times you wouldn't even know about these cemeteries. They're just built over. So it's good and bad. But again, many families, this is the way they honor their loved ones. And these cemeteries are still being used, by the way. And so what I am asking for, in addition to what I mentioned before in these plastics treaty, is really to highlight the upstream health impacts of plastics production on sacrifice zones, the systemic continuation of this demographic, along with other people of color who continually have to suffer for the impact of plastic production, especially on the upstream. And it's the life cycle, death cycle of plastic, but we have all of it as part of Louisiana. We're in all cycles, but the most dangerous part is that upstream production of the plastic. We've often heard in these talks, plastic and chemical recycling as solutions. They're absolutely not solutions for us. There is nothing that recycling can resolve for us. Plastic recycling is still breaking down the polymer, still heating it, putting out chemicals, and it doesn't stop the production of plastic on the upstream. So that's really just want to say it's not a solution for us. It hasn't worked for decades, right? We know that despite all of the recycling that we've seen and advertised on bottles and the fancy methods, we're still really at a horrible rate of recycling. So it just doesn't work. And we really want people to understand, especially for communities like ours, is not a solution at all. Also want to express that what happens in Cancer Alley is a international human rights issue, driven in large part by corporate capture of our government. We're constantly having to fight these companies coming in, being too doggone close to communities, zoning laws being changed or adjusted in order to facilitate these plans, and these corporations who are looking the other way, who do not try to help communities. They're just trying to see how they can take advantage and exploit the system. And also another factor we want to stress, the importance of reuse, repair, refurbish, anti-consumption. That's the best solution for us. It's not that I think about about plastic and how much it takes, how complex plastic is. It seems like an easy something, but really how much chemicals you got to break down, how much science you have to use, where we can go to a reuse system and sometimes it's just like take a glass, rinse it, dry it out and reuse it again. And so reminding people there are simpler solutions that have been around for eons that are still available to us now. We don't need to go and reinvent the wheel or crack all the different polymers or what have you in order to still have the same problem that we have now. And just for the relevance on the front line in my community, it's always important for us to make sure that our community knows in St. John Parish that when we're going to these talks, what it means to them, because it's one thing to be in Paris and Uruguay and Nairobi, but what makes a difference to them? And it's important really because these people are the ones who make the most impact on that decision. They're the ones voting. They're the ones who can put these people in office who can address zoning or address pollution in their communities. So we're working on communication campaigns and workshops to really break down the process to our community so they can go along with this and know that we're advocating on behalf and have more knowledge of the process. Also, we're going to develop a strategy to leverage our participation as an EJ Environmental Justice Delegation, shaping policy ordinances and laws on a local, state, federal level, and using our experience there. And also relevance to us, building capacity for frontline NGOs to build out the organizations as we participate in these negotiations. When we're leaving, when we go to these treaty talks and negotiations, we're leaving our front line, and there's a lot of work to be done. It's a lot. It's not an easy decision at all, and it's stressful because you're worrying about what's happening on the front line. People are still getting sick. People still need our help. We still have to do that, in addition to also carrying the weight of negotiating in this process. So just to know, like NGOs that are there, the frontline ones and many other ones, they need capacity to make sure that they can maintain their same presence in the community. So I think that is my last slide, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Jo, for that overview of all of these interconnected systems and their impacts on health and human rights. Appreciate you continuing to bring your stories to the treaty negotiations and to so many other spaces. These stories and experiences highlight exactly why the treaty is so important and why we need to get it right. Next, I will introduce Justine Maillot. Justine is the coordinator of the Break Free from Plastic, or BFFP, movement in Europe. She has an educational background in international, European, and environmental law. Justine has worked at the EU unit of Greenpeace, Surfrider Foundation Europe, Zero Waste Europe, and the Rethink Plastic Alliance. Welcome, Justine.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to the PPC team for having me here. Thank you very much, Larke, for setting the scene and sharing a little bit about the US position. And thank you so much, Joe, for sharing your really, really important and inspiring work. So as Rachel said, I'm the European coordinator for the Break Free from Plastic movement. So the movement counts more than 120 organizations in Europe working collectively to end plastic pollution. Maybe just a first disclaimer that Europe is a very broad and diverse region, and in the next minutes I'm going to focus on the European Union and the position of the European Union in the treaty negotiation. So the EU brings 27 member states, and it's maybe worth noting that in the context of the treaty negotiations, the EU acts as a bloc, meaning that the member states kind of coordinate their position, and then when it comes to the international negotiation, the EU speaks with one voice. So I'll focus on the EU, but of course many other European countries play an important role in the treaty negotiation. I can name Norway and the UK, for example. So maybe for a little bit of context on Europe and plastic. So about 14%, 15% more or less, depends on the year exactly, of global plastic production is actually in Europe. Part of it with feedstock coming from the US. When we consider consumption of plastic is really high in Europe, again, with quite a wide range of diversity within Europe. But if we look at Western Europe, for example, the annual plastic consumption per person is more than the double of the global average. So the Europe and the EU in particular has certainly an important responsibility in the current situation and the plastic pollution crisis we are in. And that's certainly one thing that the BFFP movement, the Break From Plastic movement, has been highlighting a lot and calling really the EU to take action that is commensurate to its responsibility in the current crisis. So the EU has this reputation to be a particularly active regulatory entity, and that's true. And there's quite a few things that have been done in the, I would say, last decades when it comes to policies related to plastic in the EU. I'll mention just a few in link to the treaty, and also we've seen that at the global level, the EU has been a very active player from the beginning of those conversations that led to the mandate to develop treaty, as Rachel said, and in the current negotiation. The EU is a member of the High Ambition Coalition, which is a group of about 60, I think 64 exactly at the moment, but I may be wrong on the exact number, which is, a group of countries from across the world that are really pushing for an ambitious treaty to be adopted. And the list of members is growing. That's why I may be slightly incorrect on the exact number, but about 60 should be correct. So maybe I wanted to go a little bit into the position of the EU in those negotiations and a few reflections from civil society on those. So what we really see from the EU in the global context, in the treaty negotiation context, is of course a lot of consistency with what has been done already at the EU level and pushing that also at the global level. So one element, for example, is around the elimination or the phasing out of some plastic products, which may be the most harmful to human health or to the environment, or for which there is better alternatives available. So that's very much in line with a single-use plastics directive that was adopted in the EU in 2019, and that is banning a number of single-use plastic and also includes other measures like reduction, EPR, labeling for a number of other single-use plastic that were not banned. And so I think the EU is also looking at how this experience and this directive could serve in the global context. And I do think there's a lot we can learn from the directive and its implementation. And that's actually true for quite a lot of legislation being in the EU or obviously across the world. Like there's already a lot of national policies or local policies that have been adopted and that can actually serve to help us design the measures in the treaty from the experience of those measures. And that's one of the reasons why we developed the global legislative database with the Plastic Pollution Coalition. So the video that Diana mentioned, that's one of the reasons for that tool, and that's where we think it can be useful. So definitely one key element on which the EU is pushing is looking at what is often referred to as problematic or avoidable plastic products. Another element that is quite core in the EU position is everything related to circular economy and circular design. So circular economy is definitely something that has been pushed from the European side. It's a concept that the EU is using a lot, which, to be fair, is not necessarily resonating in other parts of the world for different reasons. And that also raised questions around the circularity of plastic as a material, for example. But there's a number of elements around durability of products, reusability of products, chemical composition of products that is quite interesting in terms of really rethinking product at the design level. And also what the EU is looking at is possibly having sectoral approach, meaning that we need to have possibly specific requirements per sector. So let's say packaging and construction and other sectors, and in that sense, that makes sense because we may want to have tailored intervention per sector, and it may also support the involvement of the relevant stakeholders depending on the sector we're talking about. Very much related to that is the question of chemicals and polymers of concern to human health and the environment that are used in the production and in products and in plastic products. So maybe just for context, we consider that about 13,000 chemicals are used in plastic. More than 3,000 of them are considered to be of concern for human health of the environment. About 6,000 do not have hazard data, so we just don't know. And to give you an idea, only 128 chemicals of concern are currently regulated by international instruments. So that's a very little percentage. And so the EU is really looking at how do we address chemicals of concern in the plastics treaty, because clearly they're largely unregulated at the moment. And this is, from civil society, something we very much welcome. And we also welcome the fact that the EU is looking at addressing chemicals and polymers of concern in groups, meaning that we would, for example, look at all bisphenols together if we're looking at restricting bisphenols, rather than looking at bisphenol A and then maybe bisphenol S, but trying to address them as a group because they usually have the same characteristics that are causing harm to health and or the environment. So this is one also key element of the EU position, I would say, at the moment, and of others as well. And all of those elements are very much in line with what the EU has done in the recent years around their policy around circular economy, chemical strategy for sustainability, etc. What is a bit newer and that we really welcome is that we've seen in the recent months the EU taking a much stronger stance on measures on production, and the EU now clearly supporting having measures and production reduction targets in the treaty. And this is certainly very much welcome. And we really have been calling as civil society, the EU, to really be a strong advocate for provisions that would freeze and phase down production, not just of the problematic plastic, but really to all plastics, because the current level of production are just completely unsustainable. I mean, I think Joe made a very clear case on why we really need to reduce production. And also, if we're looking at achieving our climate targets, this is really a priority for the treaty. And in that sense, we've been really pushing the EU to lead on that front, and to also, for example, prioritize work between INCs, so the work between the different negotiation times, which is called intersessional period, to really prioritize work in those periods on what a reduction target could look like, what baseline we would use, etc. So for sure, production is certainly a key element to be pushing forward in the treaty. And maybe just to finish, I will mention one element on monitoring and enforcement and the financial mechanism. So if we really want the treaty and the control measures that will be set in the treaty to be effective, we really monitoring and enforcement mechanism are really key. And then making sure that the financial resources for the implementation of such an agreement are in place will also be critical. And the EU has highlighted the importance of mobilizing financial resources and looking at different sources, both public and private. From our side at civil society, we've been calling the EU and other countries and actors to really support the establishment of a new dedicated fund, because we consider that the existing international funds are not necessarily sufficient, and that we would need a dedicated fund with money that could come from different sources to really ensure the money is available to put in place the measures, and also to support the countries in the implementation of the treaty. So I think I will leave it to it. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what the EU position is. And I'll go back to you, Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Justine, for sharing more about the EU position and especially for going into the specifics about how the treaty will be implemented, which is also important but not talked about as much. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Christopher Chin. Christopher is an accomplished underwater videographer and writer whose work has been featured on the Discovery Channel. In 2006, Christopher co-founded the Center for Oceanic Awareness, Research and Education, or CORE, and he continues to serve as its executive director. Christopher is an internationally recognized expert in ocean policy and conservation issues. He has addressed various bodies of the United Nations and is actively working towards a new global treaty to address plastic pollution. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to the Plastic Pollution Coalition for putting this webinar together, and thank you all for joining and listening to this, all this discussion around this very, very important topic. I am very excited about the Global Plastic Laws Database. I remember when we, as in a lot of the folks working in this scope and this field, were tracking these things in an Excel spreadsheet and passing that around, and somebody would update it and then they would mail it to somebody else. And it really wasn't tenable, but it just shows the growth of the laws and the coverage and how important this is. I think that the scope of this and the fact that this has gained momentum so rapidly, and that there's so much impetus behind this, is because it's obvious. I'm preaching to the choir when I say this for most of you, but plastic is literally everywhere. Plastic pollution is in the air that we breathe, it's in the food that we eat, the water that we drink. It is literally everywhere. And more people are realizing this, and they're realizing that it's a problem, and they're realizing that there needs to be a solution. So it's exciting that we get to actually work on this. I remember one of the first times that I addressed a UN body from the Great Hall of Humanity at the UN headquarters in New York, and in a joint statement we called for global collaboration, global cooperation, and effort to address plastic pollution. And back then most people were talking about ocean pollution, and most people thought that we were bonkers for trying to pursue a global treaty to address plastic pollution. They thought that it was untenable, they thought that it was impossible, they thought that it would take too long. And indeed, this is and can be a slow-moving process, but this is important. And with a global problem, the only real way to wrap our heads around this and work together as a society is through global cooperation. Of course, there needs to be national action, local action, regional action, and that's all important, but there needs to be collaboration. There needs to be agreement about what things mean and how we're going to approach it. And that's where this comes in. So I'm excited to have recently been elected as the co-facilitator for the NGO major group, and that stands for non-governmental organizations. The NGO major group for the UN Environment Program. And what that means is that I am part of the major group facilitating committee, which comprises the representatives from the 9 major groups recognized by UN Environment. And that includes, among others, women, children and youth, indigenous peoples, local authorities, the NGOs, as I said, farmers, etc. So with that, I will act as one of your spokespeople and one of your gateways to the UN Environment Program. I am here to serve and help you get your messages across and act as an interface to the UN Environment Program. There are important things to remember about these discussions and negotiations, and that is that this treaty or this agreement will be the parties of this agreement, the people who are signing this, are representatives of member states. They are the countries and the regional organizations that are signing this agreement and the ones who are being held accountable to it. We as individuals and as representatives of organizations or local government are observers to the process. We are stakeholders, certainly, but we are observers to the process, and there is protocol that we all need to follow in order to engage. There have been examples where people didn't understand the way to interact and effectively got everybody thrown out of the room, and that was no fun. So it's important that we all understand how we engage in this, and that's one of the areas where someone like I or my counterparts can help you out with that. So with that, we have representatives from NGOs, representatives from the Women's Major Group, representatives from other groups and other organizations that can get accredited to these discussions. And there are many different ways that you can be involved. And basically, we need to find ways to connect people with the folks that are in the room and that can be in the room, in ways that you can have influence. And that is primarily what I wanted to talk about. I'm going to keep things short because I know that we are running way over time. But as I mentioned, I'm here to serve, I'm here to help, and very excited to see this coming into fruition. Now, who's laughing?
Thank you, Christopher. I know you've been an amazing advocate over the years, and we're very happy to have you in that position as the co-facilitator of the NGO's major group. We're now going to move on to the discussion portion of our panel. I've attempted to prioritize some of the questions that have been asked in the chat and in the questions submitted ahead of time. Some of the questions that were asked multiple times, and we'll move down the list as time allows. So I am going to start off with a question to Larke. What are the internal obstacles in the US, specifically the State Department, that are preventing the US from taking a more ambitious position on the treaty? And within that, there are also specific questions about the US's stance on production reduction. So if you could address that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, well, happy to do that. So maybe instead of sort of answering this question directly, I want to talk a little bit about the process so people understand, and they understand opportunities for engagement. So within the United States, we develop a position, and it's not a State Department position or another federal agency position. It is a US government position. I work with about 20 interagency partners from EPA, NOAA, NIST, DOE, DOD, other Ds, DOI. And we come together and we really think through from across all of the federal authorities, all of our programs, all of our activities, how can that inform how we can be as ambitious as possible? And so we take that information and then we listen to our stakeholders and the equities. We actually just held 4 stakeholder meetings. We've got one more coming up where we listen to thoughts and concerns on the US position that I outlined earlier from the private sector, civil society, the academic community. We're going to be listening to some national governments. We had a listening session with federally recognized tribes. So we take all that input as well, and we bring it to bear in terms of developing our position. So in the United States, things like the EPA's draft national strategy on plastic pollution are very important to how we develop our position. There's a lot of information and activities about how we're doing that. Domestically in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration has recognized how important this is, and they've elected to develop a position at the Council for Environmental Quality. That's a senior director level, so it's quite high level, focused on plastic pollution, chemical safety. So there's really a lot that we are doing to be as ambitious as possible on plastic pollution, and we bring that all to bear into our position. So that's how it's developed. And, again, I would urge that, we are all ambitious in wanting to solve this problem. Many countries are thinking about this in a very ambitious ways. And you have countries coming forward with very prescriptive actions to sort of limit, chemical production or chemical additives or plastic production or plastic products. We've got other countries that are thinking about it with, I think, what some people have labeled as a country-driven approach. I think for the United States, we're looking at all this information and working to be as ambitious as we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Larke. The next question is a combination of a few questions that were asked in the chat. So is lobbying by U.S. plastics producers and the agricultural industry affecting the U.S. position at the INC? What can be done to fight the power of the fossil fuel industry? And how can people urge the U.S. as well as their own governments to be more ambitious? And I'm thinking maybe on this one, we can start with Joe.
So I think we're seeing the lobbying that happened from these fossil fuel companies, and knowing the weight that they carry and the way that they have infiltrated themselves into all factors of our lives is disappointing, knowing that they can carry so much weight and seeing that happen. And it's hard when you have your community members that are dying, when you're seeing sickness, that not only, in addition to dying of cancer, they're really suffering a lot. And trying to get that message through, but then also fighting through the clutter and the noise that they put up against us when we are just really trying to do this we're lobbying for our health. We're lobbying for health, they're lobbying for money. And that's really just what it goes down to, what we see. We hear this false narrative all the time that they're job creators, and the economy that they produce, often these jobs are subsidized or getting government funding or getting funding from the state, like in Louisiana, that programs that take millions of tax dollars off of the records for us. We're also finding out that in a recent study that we had in St. John Parish, that the jobs that they have are not going to workers of color, particularly Black workers. So the jobs narrative, the money that they produce, and there's so much cost associated with this. Although the picture that they're showing is that they're so needed and they're such creators of economy, and that's showing how much they take away from that. So that's one message that we try to just show the facts of how it really looks, what it really looks like on the fence side. Is not the shiny marketing, is not the little gifts they always give people or the turkeys they like to give people for Thanksgiving. It really comes down to the fact that everything they give us costs us a heck of a lot of money. They cost us so much money in health and economy and tax breaks. And it's time that we all wake up to the tactics that they use, all people.
Thanks, Joe. The next question is a bit similar, but what are some feedback mechanisms or entry points for NGOs, civil society, young people, etc., for advocating on the plastics treaty? And maybe Christopher, you can lead off on this one.
Sure. I gave a little bit of a hint to this in my presentation, but basically one way that you could be involved is if you ended up on one of the state delegations, and that certainly happens. People who work for the government, or if you are somebody who knows a lot of information, you can be valuable to your government as a consultant, and it's not unheard of to have people on a state delegation who really knows what they're talking about and can act in that manner. It's much more likely where somebody in this organization, somebody in this group, would be involved through one of the local NGOs or through another group that's that is affiliated or accredited to the UN Environment Program, or through the UN ECOSOC, the Environmental, Economic and Social Council. Sorry, and there's also another manner that you can be accredited to attend one of the meetings, and that is through any of the multilateral environmental agreements, or MEA, which is administered by the UN Environment Program. Examples of that are like the Minamata Convention and the some of the other treaties like Montreal Protocol, the CITES, for example, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. All of these are mechanisms where people can be accredited directly through an organization to attend the meetings. And that's one great way to be there on the ground, but certainly you don't have to be at the meeting. You don't have to be in the room where all of these discussions are happening. A lot of the discussions actually take place in the hallway, or they take place in between the meetings, as was discussed. So if you're not already attached to an organization or involved, join one of the organizations and see how you can help. Volunteer with one of the organizations and learn how you can be involved. And certainly if you're not, and you're looking for somebody to chat with, then find somebody who is involved. Contact the Plastic Pollution Coalition or any of the folks in this room, and see how you can be involved. And we will steer your energy in the right direction to help make things happen.
Thanks, Christopher. And following up on that, I think specifically it would be great to hear, Larke, from you about how people can help urge the US to be more ambitious in the treaty.
Absolutely. So first off, if you're not on our stakeholder list and you want to be, that's item number one. So really welcome that. We have stakeholder meetings regularly. It's a great opportunity for us to share information about US positioning, what's happening at the negotiations, sort of how we're approaching them. If I welcome you sharing my email to folks, and my colleague Luke Simmons, if you want to put your email in our chat, he will collect it and we will add you to our stakeholder list. So that's absolutely, excuse me, the first way that I would recommend. And this is because, from our perspective, it is important to hear from our stakeholders. We want to have a strong and robust engagement. I've had the benefit and pleasure of knowing a number of my panelists for a few years now as we've worked together in this process, and those opportunities are good. They're very meaningful for exchange. As Christopher noted, and I'm sure as both have experienced, at the INC is another opportunity. There's an opportunity to engage with the US delegation. At previous INCs, we've had upwards of 20 folks. So there is an opportunity to hear from us, to have a specific discussion on the issues. I know we've undertaken those with a number of these panelists, and probably I scanned the list. I've recognized some names, probably some of the organizations that are attending today. So those are two great ways to engage. We also welcome receiving information. If you have a letter your organization would like to send, that can be helpful. I would note sometimes those consolidated letters are a little bit easier for us to process if you come together as a group. So really a lot of opportunities to reach out and to hear from us. Another option is you can invite us to things like this with your organizations or your consortium. We really welcome that external engagement. It's always a benefit for us when we get to have these exchanges. And, this administration is absolutely committed to solving this problem at a global level, doing it in a collaborative way. And for us, that means really working hard to engage with everyone. So I hope that gives folks some ideas. And, my colleague Luke did put his email online, so please, feel free to email him and we'll get that added to our stakeholder engagement list. Thanks.
Thanks all. And as we're out of time, I just want to hold some space in case anyone has one final closing thought before I kick it back to Diana to end the webinar.
Maybe I'll just share one thing in addition to maybe what Christopher shared, is that there's many ways of engaging, and sometimes the treaty feels like something extremely technical happening far away from our realities, but the reality is that the treaty is super relevant to everything that is happening at the local national level, and everything that is happening at the local and national level is super relevant to the treaty. The reason we're having a treaty now is because people mobilized around plastic pollution and its impact, because legislation have been adopted at local national level, and that's why we're there. So I would say, in addition to what Christopher mentioned on how you can engage maybe more formally on the treaty, continue to engage at the local level, in your community, in your campus, if you're a student, with your local and national decision makers. Every action that is happening at all levels is having a big impact. So I'll just share that. Thank you.
Thanks, Justine. I think that's really important to remember, especially because the treaty is a longer term negotiation, but obviously everyone can have an impact at the moment in their local communities, and plastic is something that affects all of us. So it's important to remember that. Thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to our panelists, Joe Banner, Christopher Chin, Justine Maillot, and Larke Williams for joining us today and providing such a rich and valuable conversation. And I will now turn it back to you, Diana.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, for leading this invigorating conversation with our wonderful panel. I feel like we need, of course, as always, more time to dive deeper. This is a big topic, but I'm so excited to see the traction and what we've accomplished so far. I wanted to let everyone know we've had so many great questions in the Q&A that clearly we did not have time to answer them all, and we've captured those questions, and we'll do our best to share responses from our panelists in a follow-up blog. So please stay tuned for that. This will be our final webinar of 2023, as we're focused on promoting the new Global Plastic Laws database. We hope that you'll check out the tool, use the database in the work that you're doing. And we're also working on an upcoming holiday guide, and we hope you'll check that out when it's ready. We'll be back with a new webinar on January 18th, Plastic-Free Resolutions, Protecting Your Health in 2024. Please mark your calendars and keep an eye out for more details soon. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our global coalition. It is currently free to join as an individual, business, or nonprofit organization. You can also connect with us on social media to learn more about our work. We will be sending out a follow-up survey after the webinar and appreciate your feedback to help us improve our future events. We will also send out the recording of this webinar in the coming days so that you may share it with anyone who was unable to join us today. I want to again big thank you to everyone for tuning in, for joining us, and for all of our panelists. Thank you for joining. Thanks also to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and networks. And thank you to our team in the background, the Plastic Pollution Coalition team, for producing this webinar in the series. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on January 18th, 2024. See you soon.